So in the last video, I promised that I was going to talk about China owning our debt and any problems this might entail. But first, I forgot there was this last slide here. Can any debt be good? Well, while economists will argue about how serious debt can be, I also forgot to mention just a little bit of trivia. January 1st, 1835 is the only time in the United States history that there was no national debt. So a lot of economists think debt is really not that big of a deal because we've pretty much always had it. That was the Andrew Jackson administration when it was all paid off, and we've been racking it up ever since. Debt to GDP is a bit more of an important number, and inflation has to be taken into consideration when thinking about all the last few years. We've accumulated more debt than all the presidents combined. Bad President Obama, bad President whoever. Well, take into account inflation and debt to GDP ratios, and it turns out that that's not exactly what has happened. But anyway, economists who worry about debt, do even they agree that it can be good? Well, yes. Debt that is driven by something like Social Security can be dangerous because you get to the point where you owe money but you don't have the money to pay. But debt that pays for something like the National Highway Project, something that people are going to use, that's going to be beneficial to the economy. This was in the 1950s. And once it's done, it's done. You're not going into any more debt. It's kind of like going into debt to buy a house. If you go into debt to play a few rounds on a slot machine, that's a bad idea from a personal finance standpoint. But if you go into debt to buy a house, that can be a great idea for a lot of people. So it's kind of the same principle. And then if there's a war, pretty much every war we had to go into debt to fight it because they can be expensive. Now, we're not sure that it's a good war to get involved in, and maybe no war is. That's kind of beyond the scope of this class. But if it is a good war to get involved in, World War II was pretty much the entire country agreed that we should be fighting that war. So going into debt to finance that war, economists see that as somewhat sustainable because every war is going to come to an end. At least every war has so far, present wars notwithstanding. So if you go into debt to do something temporary that the entire nation agrees on doing, it might not be a bad thing. So, speaking of potential bad things, as promised, let's talk about China. And for that, let's go back to externally held debt. Is this a problem that China has so much of our debt? You'll hear a lot of people worry about whether we're going to be okay given all the debt that China owes. We're screwed, right? They can get us anytime. China, we have a complicated relationship with them, right? They're a trading partner. We're supposed to be friends, but everyone knows that there's some strain in the relationship. And if China could take us down a peg and become a little more dominant relative to us on the international stage, well, they'd like to do that, right? Now, a lot of this goes beyond the scope of economics, but economics is in so many things without people realizing it. And this is one of those areas where economists, of course, have something to say about whether China owning so much of our debt is a problem. What do I mean by so much of our debt? You might have heard that China owns a third of all U.S. debt. Man, that's a big chunk of it. $20 trillion worth of debt, more or less. A whole third of that is owed to China. And the reason we're supposed to be worried is because they can call it in at any time, right? If they call in that debt, they are going to drain our economy of trillions of dollars and just sink us. That's U.S. debt as a national security issue. We need to do something about it, right? It's a serious problem. Well, let's see if some of that is true. Let's hold the phone on our fears for a second here. I've had students who were losing sleep over this one, and I was very happy to help them feel a little bit better about it. Does China own a third of our debt? Let's start with that. The answer is no. Short and long answers are no. They do not own anywhere close to a third of our debt. About 30% of our debt is externally held. and the vast majority of it is internally held. So if 30% of our debt is external, by the way, the internally held debt, I mentioned mutual funds, a lot of that is actually held by federal agencies, which is not debt monetization necessarily. It's a way of paying them. Hey, you have a budget for the next 5 years, and here's what it is. Here's the cash for right now, and then here are some bonds that are going to come to maturity, and that'll be our debt servicing part of the budget going forward. It's not monetizing, it's accounting more than anything else. And then the Federal Reserve owns a lot of debt, but is it because they printed money and gave it to the federal government? Well, no, the Federal Reserve can't print money, the Treasury does. The Federal Reserve, a lot of the debt that it owns is debt that it bought from banks. We'll get to that when we talk about the Fed, how that works, but it's not debt monetization, even though it might look like it at first glance. And debt monetization is a problem, which is why externally held debt might not be such a bad thing. You can't monetize, well, you can monetize the payments, but you're not sending payments to the Federal Reserve. That can be somewhat inflationary. Here you're sending payments outside of the country to people who are maybe going to send it back in a lot of respects, and some of it might not go back. But 30% of our debt is externally held. China owns the majority of that 30%. Does that mean China owns a third of our debt? Well, mathematically, it can't be. About a third of our debt is externally held, and China owns most of that external debt. The amount of debt that China holds is about $1 trillion, which is not a third of 20 trillion. They've never owned more than about 9.1% of our debt, which was in 2011. And now it's about 5% of our debt is all that they have. 5%, not a third. That's a pretty big difference. But that's still a lot of money. That's $1 trillion. They can just drain right out of our economy, can't they? So let's all be scared of that. Well, let's go back to pretending they had a third of our debt. Let's make this problem even bigger and see if it's actually a problem. Can they actually just call in the debt? Well, if you happen to own any T-bills, maybe you could take a look at the contractual arrangement there and see if it entitles you to money that you could just call in at any time. Now, if you go to the federal government and say, I would like you to give me back all the money that is owed on this contract, they might say yes. But they can also say no, and there's nothing really you can do about it unless you own a type of bond that says that you're entitled to a certain amount of money at a certain period of time. So the analogy here is if you took out $500,000 to buy a house, and the agreement was that over the course of 30 years, you're going to make a payment of a few $1,000s a month for 30 years, and then that's the end of it. If the bank calls you up a couple years into that deal and says, give me back all the money, change my mind, you can laugh at them, essentially. They legally, they're not going to do that, by the way. They legally can't. The loan contract specifies how it's going to be paid back. With a mortgage, you can actually say, I'm going to pay it back now because I want to, and they have to accept the payments, but they can't tell you to pay it back. They can't just call it in. Maybe there's some loan contracts built like that, but most loan contracts, it's a specific amount of money to be paid back over a specific amount of time. Why are you going to loan money to people if they're not going to use it? You loan money to somebody, they're going to buy some new capital equipment to grow their business. They don't have the money to be called back. So same thing with U.S. Treasuries. China can't just pick up the phone and call it all back, especially since it's not just the Chinese government. A lot of China owns the businesses in some sense or another, but it's still a lot of different people who own that debt who would have to just pile it all together and without revolting against the government, except that it's being called in. But either way, it's not going to work. They can't legally make us pay them. Even if some international court decided to change the law at the last minute and say, yeah, but you still do have to pay them back. I'm no military expert, but I don't think China's able to sail their navy across the ocean and invade us to make them pay it back. So there's that too. Our Navy could probably sink all their vessels without firing a shot just by laughing at their effort. Again, I'm not a military expert, but I don't think they can force us to pay the money back. So certainly they can't do it legally. One other thing that is brought up then for those who have realized, oh, they can't call it in. Okay, but they can offload all that debt by selling it all on bond markets. And yes, that they can do legally. But from our standpoint, that just means that the money we send to whoever owns the debt is going to go somewhere else. Maybe they sold some of it to someone in Norway. Okay, well, we'll just send that money to Norway instead of China when the bond contract comes due and we send the money somewhere. If somebody in France bought the debt, then we just send the money to France. Maybe somebody in Nebraska bought some of the bonds that China was trying to sell. So we just send that money to someone in Nebraska. Doesn't make any difference to us. And in fact, this will hurt China, not because it'll crash their economy because they hurt one of their customers, because they didn't hurt us. That's the standard response. They don't want to hurt us. We're their big customer. So they hurt us. They hurt themselves. Mutually assured destruction. Okay, fine. But they can't hurt us. So that doesn't actually apply here. The reason they would hurt themselves, and this becomes more relevant when we talk about international finance, the United States dollar is the reserve currency. This is another thing that people scare themselves with. I'll address why we shouldn't be scared of that either during international finance. But China owns so much of our debt, not because they wanted to get some sort of position of power over us. They didn't do it on purpose. They did it because it helps facilitate trade. We're not going to get into the mechanics of how exactly that works, but it's easier to trade with the United States if you have something that people will accept as payment, and bonds are oftentimes given and accepted as payment. Oftentimes because it's easy to transfer electronically without foreign exchange rates messing things up. You already have the payment ready to go. So a high level of trade between the countries has resulted in a high level of U.S. debt held by Chinese interests, Chinese businesses, as well as the Chinese government. It's something that just kind of happened on its own without anybody meaning to make it happen, and it's not something anybody can use to hurt anybody. It's just a way of making financial transactions work. So, if you were one of those losing sleep over the precarious situation in which China could call in a third of our debt at the last minute, well, hopefully you're able to sleep a little better now. So that is everything you need to know about national debt, and you are ready for exam 2, which will come up soon. Enjoy!